Your lecturer is Professor Seth Freeman. Professor Freeman is an adjunct professor at New York University Stern School of Business and at Columbia University. He holds a BA in economics from Cornell University and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Freeman has taught negotiation around the world and routinely trains business executives, engineers, law students, and United Nations diplomats. His insights on negotiation have been featured on Bloomberg TV and in the New York Times, The Washington Post, USA Today, and other major media outlets. He is the author of The Ready and Able Negotiator.
Hi, I'd like to tell you a brief story. A few years before he took my negotiation course, a student of mine, who I'll call Steve, bought a car together with a warranty against rust. If the car rusted, they'd fix it for him at no charge. 4 years later, while he was taking my course, Steve noticed that the car had rusted. So he took it back to the dealer and said, "Hi, here's my car. You can see the rust, so would you please fix it for me?" But to his surprise, the dealer said, "I'm sorry, kid, but we can't help you." "Why not? Here's the paperwork. There's your signature." No, kid. You don't understand. We didn't sell you this policy. A third-party warranty company did. And unfortunately, they've gone bankrupt. We wish we could help you, but of course it's not our responsibility, so bye. Now, whenever you're in a conflict like Steve was, you have an autonomic reaction. The adrenaline rises, and with it comes the fight or flight response. You either want to yell and hit someone, or you want to go and run and hide under a bridge somewhere. But from his training, Steve knew that there was a third choice: negotiate. And he also knew he wasn't ready to solve the problem because, as we will see, one of the keys to excellent negotiation is excellent preparation. So Steve practiced one of the most important and simple ideas a negotiator relies on. Steve got out of there. That is, he left, or as we say, he went to the balcony. Doing that permitted him to do a number of preparation tasks, including research, which included calling a friend of his, Bob, a bankruptcy attorney. Steve explained the problem and asked Bob to learn about the warranty company. A couple of days later, Bob called Steve back and said, "I learned something interesting about the warranty company. It's owned by the car dealer." So, Steve returns to the dealer and he said, "You should have seen the look on the dealer's face when I walked in. Total contempt, total disdain. 'Look,' said the dealer, 'I thought I was clear. We can't help you.' To which Steve calmly replied, 'I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that your firm owns the bankrupt warranty company. Is that true?' Tacit implication: either you work with me fairly now, or you'll hear from the Attorney General of the state of New York." In response, the car dealer looked away, went red in the face, started speaking quickly, and changed the subject. All of which signaled to Steve that something dramatic had just shifted. And within a few minutes, Steve left that dealership with a check for the full amount he needed to properly repair the car. A just and fair result achieved calmly when others would have been shouting ineffectively or running away. Now, Steve would probably be the first to tell you that his success did not come naturally. He was not a born negotiator. But boy, how well he learned. And that's why I wanted to share his story with you as we begin our course on negotiation, because it illustrates that negotiation is learnable and that it actually depends in part on things you already do well, like learning things, and that like Steve, you can be much more effective than you may first think. In the process, negotiation training can help you achieve justice, peace, and prosperity, and do it in respectful, principled ways. These are some of the reasons why I am so passionate about this subject, which I've had the pleasure of teaching for 20 years. Another is because I'm like Steve. I'm not a natural negotiator either. I teach what I want to learn, and I want to learn how to turn impasses into satisfying agreements, how to deal well with conflicts and do it wisely, how to be an effective advocate for justice, how to collaborate when everyone thinks it's impossible, even at times, how to make peace. And so I want to warmly welcome you, especially if you don't enjoy negotiating. Secret, most of us don't initially, and I can prove it. It turns out that the word itself, negotiate, comes from the Latin root neg, which means not, and otium, which means leisure. That's right. For 2,000 years, people have said that negotiation is many things, but leisure is not one of them. So welcome. Most of us discover that, as the etymology implies, negotiation simply demands some work, as Steve showed, work that you definitely can learn to do well. But that said, I want to share one of my concerns about teaching negotiation. It's possible to receive negotiation training in a way that makes you think of people instrumentally as a means to your end. So that whenever your significant other says, will you dump the garbage? Your comeback line is, well, will you walk the dog? That's a good way to get her to say, ever since you took that negotiating course, it's like there's some string attached. Why can't you do something for me for a change because you love me? And she'll be right to ask. So throughout our course, I'll be challenging you to take a high view of negotiation, to aspire to do more, not less, than to master simple transacting. To not see every interaction as a short-run transaction, but to see how you can use your skills in remarkable ways. Wait till you see. I've seen students use their training to talk friends out of killing themselves, to save businesses that were collapsing. Of course, I've seen them negotiate many, many times for fair and favorable salaries and prices. And I've seen them save families that were falling apart at the gravesite, convince donors to wisely give more in the middle of recessions, to get alienated teams to collaborate well, and generally to be effective yet gentle on other people in ways that very often enhance their relationships. These are the abilities we want to develop. And let me linger briefly on that word, develop. This is not one of those courses where the professor knows everything and you know nothing. The truth is, you've been negotiating since shortly after you left the womb, and you have a lifetime of experience doing it. So part of our challenge here will be to discover many of the things you already are doing well, so that you can choose to do them more intentionally, and so that much more successfully. But also to discover things that may be getting in the way for you, so that you can choose not to do them, and so be that much more successful. But regardless, to add to the mix a group of skills, principles, concepts, frameworks, and ideas that together can dramatically improve your ability to negotiate wherever you feel you are with it right now. In our course, we'll spend the first several sessions putting together the elements of the toolkit, a framework really, that we'll bring together in session 14. With that framework in place, we'll be able to explore a wide range of important advanced topics in later sessions. And so we'll answer a host of big questions. What does it take to be an excellent negotiator? What should you strive for? How do you cope when you're emotional? What if you feel weak and the other person seems like Godzilla? Can you really negotiate with irrational people? Should you make the first offer? Can you negotiate when trust is low? Can you negotiate with people from other countries, with children? And how does an understanding of negotiation help you to be more effective as a leader, friend, spouse, consumer, family member, colleague, citizen, student of history, and more? The starting point for our work is to consider that there are really two basic ways to negotiate. One way is called distributive bargaining. That term refers to competitive negotiating, hard bargaining, haggling, win-lose negotiating. For many of us, distributive bargaining is what negotiation is all about. Small wonder many of us don't like it. Now, as we'll see, distributive bargaining very definitely has a place in our work. If you don't know how to do it, the other negotiator may be able to take real advantage of you. And indeed, justice may require us to be skilled in that work. Later in the course, we will meet with people who accepted very unfair salaries because they didn't know much about how to negotiate distributively, and that makes me angry. I don't want that for you or anyone I care about to be treated unfairly. But all that said, it is true that distributive bargaining and distributive thinking can lead to serious problems. This morning on the news, you woke to reports of places all around the world that are filled with violence because everyone there is stuck in a distributive outlook, the belief that the only way we can be happy is at your expense. And so they spiral down in a cycle of conflict. Is negotiation mainly about being tough and aggressive? Al Capone put it this way: you can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone. But is it true that negotiation is the continuation of war by other means? Do you have to treat negotiation as a fight where the only way to do well is to bargain hard and claim lots of the pie at the other's expense? Or is there a way to negotiate that satisfies both sides well? In this session, we'll look at a second way to negotiate, an alternative to distributive bargaining, a way that often lets you find agreements that both sides are very happy about. It's called interest-based bargaining. Interest-based bargaining doesn't always work, and it has real limitations, but often it can help you create peace and prosperity that seemed impossible at first. And for that reason, I think it's a great idea. Specifically, let's look at 3 questions. First, what is interest-based bargaining? Why is it so valuable? And how do you do it? Second, what are its limitations? And lastly, how can you put it into practice immediately? So what is interest-based bargaining? And why is it so valuable? It's an approach to negotiation that lets you be hard on the problem, soft on the person. In other words, it lets you fight hard for what you really care about, and yet do it in a way that lets you be generous, flexible, and trustworthy toward the other person. All your life you've wondered, should I be tough or nice in negotiation? And you've gone back and forth on it, haven't you? First you think, I'm going to be nice to make sure that you don't hurt the relationship. But then you wind up feeling taken advantage of and giving away the store, and you think, okay, no more Mr. Nice Guy, I'm going to be tough, so that you get a healthy share of the pie. But then you find you're alienating people, and you're having serious breakdowns. So what do? Should you be nice or tough? Interest-based bargaining says the answer is yes, be both. Fight for what you care about, and yet find a way to do it that serves the other well too. We'll see how in a moment. But interest-based bargaining is also valuable because it helps you wisely bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps and discover hidden opportunities. Today's world sure seems to have lots of scarcity and limited opportunity. But you can enter into that world and say, I see opportunity, and I'm not just whistling a happy tune. I actually know a way to find it. So how do you do it? Well, here's the one-line summary, the bumper sticker thesis statement. Get the next sentence I say, and you've got the gist of this entire session. Focus on interests, not positions, and then reconcile them with creative options. Let me say that again. Focus on interests, not positions, and then reconcile them with creative options. Now, I could tell you what I mean by that, but instead of telling you, I'd like to show you by sharing a story called The Parable of the Orange. Imagine that earlier today, I was in a cafeteria and I saw that they had this one last orange on the counter. I went to reach for it, but at the very moment I grabbed it, a guy named Bob grabbed it too. So now we're both holding the orange and we're staring at each other, and I tried to politely signal to Bob that I think I saw it first, and Bob tugged back as if to say, no, it was his. And so I tugged a little harder, and so did Bob. And before you knew it, we were both on the floor struggling over it until I finally said, okay, I'll cut the stupid thing in half. At which point Bob let go. I took out a knife, cut it in half, dividing it equally, and gave him half. I took my half of the orange, peeled it, threw the meat away, took the rind, and made marmalade with it. Meanwhile, Bob took his half of the orange, threw the rind away, took the meat, and made orange juice with it. Now, if we'd asked each other just one question, yes, even a seemingly dumb-sounding question, we could have literally doubled what we each wound up with. What was the question? As you probably guessed, it was, wait a minute. Why do you want the orange? What do you want to do with it? Bob had asked me that simple question. I would have replied, what? That's a dumb question. What other possible reason could there be for wanting an orange other than to make marmalade? And then Bob would have told me. And suddenly the little light would have gone on over my head, and I would have said, oh, wait a minute. You're saying that the rind is garbage to you? And that there's an easy way to make you happy? That you actually like the meat? Wait, I would have said, retrieving the parts that we'd just thrown away. Here, you can have the meat, and I'll take the leftover rind, and now reach twice as well off, thanks to your excellent question. Now, let's take a closer look at that story, because it can tell us a lot about interest-based bargaining. At the start of this conflict, Bob and I were so divided that it was as if we were on opposite sides of a canyon. Each of us was saying, I want the orange. We were taking positions. What's a position? A position is the thing you say you want. It's your demand. It's the one and only one thing you think will make you happy. Now, there's nothing wrong with taking a position. Sometimes you have to. But there is a danger. And the danger is that we can easily fall into a positional impasse, as we did in the first part of the story, a deadlock over our conflicting demands. The persistence of violence around the world that we read about and despair of is often driven by the fact that people have fallen into positional impasse. And you know people who are locked in bitter litigation or broken relationships because of positional impasse. And wars and street shootings can stem from the same problem. Positional impasses are driven by a simple dilemma. If the only way to make me happy is to give me something that you can't or won't give me, then what can I do? I can demand it more loudly. I can turn it into a test of rights or power. And for a while, Bob and I did just that, fighting it out on the ground. Alternatively, we can agree, as we eventually did here, to a mediocre compromise. But what if we ask the seemingly dumb but actually brilliant question that you may well have suggested earlier? Why do you want it? When you ask that question, you're going below the level of positions to the level of interests. What's an interest? It's the reason why I want what I say I want. It's my underlying concern, my deeper need, my motivation, my drive. And it turns out that at the level of interests, there's often no conflict at all, because our interests, though different, may well complement each other. That is, it may well be that there are several ways to satisfy my interest, some of which are very easy for the other to give me. And vice versa, there may be several ways to satisfy the other's interest, some of which are very easy for me to give. We call these complementary interests. And when we find them, it suggests the possibility that a creative option, a non-obvious way to trade or deal, can help us both. Here, what if you take the meat and I take the rind? And what do you know? We're both happy to say yes, happy to swap the sheep for the deer, and we're both far better off. Now, you might hear this and say, Professor Freeman, that's a nice story, but can this idea of focusing on interests, not positions, and then reconciling them with creative options, Can it work with the difficult and complex negotiations we see in the real world? And that's a fair question. So let's test it out. Let's take it to the most conflict-ridden place in the world and see if it can work there. And my nomination for that sad distinction is the Middle East. Can interest-based bargaining work there? And the answer is not only can it, but twice in the last several decades, it has been essential. Let me illustrate with one example, the Camp David Peace Accords. In 1973, Egypt and Israel fought the Yom Kippur War, and after several weeks of fighting, they entered a fragile truce. But for several years after, they were this close to going back to war. Then, in 1978, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel flew to Camp David to meet with President Jimmy Carter to talk about a possible peace accord. Everyone at the time knew this was a fool's errand. No Arab state had entered into an individual peace treaty with the State of Israel, and sure enough, on the first day of the conference, the two sides reached an impasse over the status of the Sinai Peninsula, that triangular piece of desert between the two countries. Egypt said, "We want the Sinai." Israel said, "No, we want the Sinai." Sound familiar? They were taking positions. But then someone asked the seemingly dumb question, wait, why does Egypt want the Sinai? To which Anwar Sadat replied, "We want sovereignty." Someone also asked, wait, why does Israel want the Sinai? And Menachem Begin replied, "We want security." Then someone asked an even more seemingly dumb question. What do you mean? Not what is that supposed to mean, but rather, really, what do you mean when you use that word? When you ask that question, you're actually going even deeper below the surface of the conflict into the realm of interests. So, Mr. Sadat, what do you mean by sovereignty? To which Sadat replied, "We mean we want our flag to fly over the territory. We want the maps of the world to say this is Egyptian soil, and we want our civilians to settle there. Do you care whether you have military there? We'd like it," Sadat said, "but it's not essential to us." Mr. Begin, what does Israel mean by security? To which Begin replied, "We mean no surprise attack. We want a buffer zone. We don't want to die in our beds. Do you care if the Egyptian flag flies over the territory, or if the maps of the world say it's Egyptian soil, or that Egyptian civilians get to settle there?" "No," Begin said, we're concerned about life and death. Those won't kill us, but there can be no military." Wait a minute. Do you see a possible deal here? What if we agreed that Egypt gets to fly its flag over the territory, the maps of the world will say it's Egyptian soil, and that Egyptian civilians get to settle there, but that there'll be no military from either side there, making the peninsula a demilitarized zone, thus creating a buffer zone that will protect Israel from surprise attack? Oh, and the U.S. will provide Israel with real-time satellite images to guard against Egyptian troop movements. In response to which, Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin both said, "Okay," and we had our first breakthrough. And after several more days of difficult talks, the three leaders flew to the White House, where they signed the Camp David Peace Accords, for which all three men eventually won the Nobel Peace Prize. But more importantly, that treaty, although it's certainly been tested in recent years, has never been broken. The two sides never went back to war, even decades later, which by some measures makes it one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of the 20th century. How did they do that? One of the keys was focusing on interests, not positions, and satisfying them with creative options. Now here's my modest proposal. If this idea is so powerful that it can bring about peace in the Middle East, then maybe, just maybe, it can help us handle the difficult negotiations we're grappling with in our own lives. There's good evidence that thinking about such things can make a big difference for you. In 2010, Professor Karen Walsh, a scholar from Thunderbird School of Management, published a 3-year study of 250 negotiators, half systematically prepared, thinking intentionally about interests and options, among other things. The others prepared casually, without intentionally focusing on such things. Walsh found that those who thought systematically about interests and options created over 11% more wealth for themselves than the casual negotiators did. More remarkably, she found the intentional negotiators also created over 6% more wealth for their counterparts than casual negotiators did. They measurably satisfied both sides much better, creating total pies that were over 17% larger. So how can an interest-based approach work in our own daily lives? Let me illustrate with one of the hundreds of examples my students have produced over the years, a story I call Impasse 4.0. My student, who I'll call Mike, was at his office one day, the software firm he worked for, when he got a call from Brenda, an executive at his firm's biggest client. Brenda asked him if his firm would deliver a full 2 weeks early, the custom software that the client had ordered. He was stunned, but politely said he'd check with his engineers, who told him it was impossible, and he relayed the news to Brenda. Unhappy, Brenda told her boss Betty, who immediately called Mike's boss and gave him a serious warning. If we don't get that software in 2 weeks, you'll lose us. And we need an answer in 15 minutes. So the boss called Mike and the engineers to an emergency meeting and explained the challenge. Immediately, the engineers were in an uproar. We told Mike we can't finish the software in 2 weeks. We can't do it. You don't understand, said the boss. This client can shut our lights off. We've got to do it in 2 weeks. We can't. We've got to. Can't. Got to. Sound familiar? Mike realized they were stuck in a positional impasse. So he asked our dumb question. Wait, he said, why can't we do it in 2 weeks? The engineers were outraged at the question. Don't you get it? There are 10 different features to the software. Each is interconnected, and it'll take 4 weeks to test them all. Oh, okay, said Mike. Why do you suppose they want the software in 2 weeks? Suddenly the room went quiet. They weren't sure. But as they each traded facets of their understanding, they started to see it. The client needed the software to launch and run a telephone marketing campaign in 2 weeks. Well, said Mike, is there any way we can help the client successfully launch the telephone marketing campaign even if we can't deliver the software in 2 weeks? And now they started to think and develop a few ideas. Whoops, time's up, got to call her back. And now, with Mike's coaching, the boss says, Betty, we think we have something for you. But before we share it with you, can you tell us why you need the software so soon? As they suspected, it was because of the telephone marketing launch. Well, said the boss, again with Mike's coaching, if you really need the software itself in 2 weeks, I got to tell you, no reputable firm could promise it by then. But, Betty, if your goal is to launch the telemarketing campaign in time, we can help. We have a couple of colleagues here who can manually do the functions the software will eventually do, and we can lend them to you until the software is ready to take over. Would that help? You would do that for us, Betty asked. Of course, said the boss. Thank you. This gives me something good I can give my bosses. You guys are great. And a few hours later, Betty called back saying, we may take you up on your offer, but regardless, you'll be hearing a lot from us. You're the kind of supplier we prize. Now, do you see the arc of that story? We'll all get a call like the one Mike got. You pick up the phone, and suddenly your career is going down the tubes. But somehow, Mike did something that not only turned things around, but actually put them in a better place eventually. His firm's relationship with its key client wound up being stronger thanks to the way he handled the conflict. And Mike was a hero because the client saw that even when you can't do what we say we want, you find a way to meet our needs. And that's valuable. How do you do something like that? You focus on interests, not positions, and satisfy them with creative options. How then can you do interest-based bargaining more effectively and more confidently? Here is a simple step-by-step set of suggestions. First, if you can, prepare by thinking carefully about your interests, the other negotiators, and some creative options that might satisfy them. Second, do some research to deepen your understanding of the interests and options. Then, start the talks by taking time to build trust and rapport and set a positive tone. It can be a good idea to note that you have real hope that together you'll find something you both feel very happy with. That's important because the other person is probably anxious and worried too. Your encouragement can help foster real hope and collaboration. Fourth, instead of talking about price and demands early on, ask questions and listen for insights about the other's interests. For example, you can say, "Let me first listen and get your concerns here." If he makes demands, you can use some of our famous dumb questions like, "Why?" and "What do you mean?" As we've seen, the more you learn about his interests, the better you can find solutions that serve you both. Regardless of his willingness to share information, share some information about your own interests. True, it's not necessary or wise to reveal everything, like desperation. For example, "Look, if I don't sell this car today, I'll lose my job." Not good. The other negotiator will be tempted to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I'll give you $1 for it." But by sharing your interests, you can actually invite the other negotiator to help you solve your problem creatively. Sixth, once you've discussed interests, you can invite conversation about creative options. First, suggest one or two and invite the other negotiator to suggest options as well. That way, you're practicing a ready, aim, fire approach that most likely will help you find a well-suited solution. No success initially? Try suggesting more options. Interest-based bargaining is, as we said, a powerful idea, but it's really just one side of the coin. And again, we'll need to understand distributive negotiation too, the challenge of dividing the pie in wise, fair, and often favorable ways. And we will. But for now, let's summarize what this session on interest-based bargaining means for you in your real-life transactions, conflicts, relational issues, and other important negotiations. Focus on interests and not positions and satisfy them with creative options. Remember, this lets you bridge gaps and satisfy both sides well. To practice that, take the interests and options challenge. This week, the next time you're in a difficult conflict or negotiation, see what happens if you slow down. Think about your interests, learn about the other person's, think about a few creative ways to satisfy her needs and yours, and then negotiate. One of the biggest surprises in interest-based bargaining is the importance and power of understanding the other person. Surprisingly, skilled negotiators spend far more time thinking about the other person than mediocre negotiators do. So it's to that figure, the undiscovered continent, that we turn next.